All right, I'm going to try this again. I may have to mute some points to cough. I am a little sick, but I really want to read this essay, and I'm hoping my voice will carry through. This is from American Horrors, Essays on the Modern American Horror Film, edited by Gregory A. Waller, and the essay today, the second essay in the book, The Trauma of Infancy in Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, by Virginia Wright Wexman. A little about the author. Drawing on material included in her 1985 book, Roman Polanski, Virginia Wright Wexman situates Rosemary's Baby in the context of Polanski's career, particularly his other horror films, which take as their principal concern not simply the other, a time-honored motif in the genre, but otherness itself. Wexman argues that by presenting insanity, regression, physical alienation, and female sexual dis-ease against a realistic backdrop, Rosemary's Baby and Polanski's other horror films evoke the sort of ambiguity that Svetlana Todorov finds to be characteristic of the fantastic. Unlike Dillard, Wexman devotes considerable attention to the textual positioning of the film viewer and thus raises fundamental questions about our role in and response to horror films. Wexman teaches in the Department of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is the editor of Cinema Journal. Okay, let's start the essay again. Roman Polanski's career encompasses both high art and popular entertainment, while some of his films such as Knife in the Water, Cul-de-sac, and What grow out of the absurdist tradition of the modern Polish theater in which he grew up. Others, like Repulsion, Dance of the Vampires, Rosemary's Baby, and The Tenant, are variations on the popular horror formula. While Polanski's absurdist projects represent, by and large, uncompromising modernist statements, his horror films have been created to appeal to a mass audience. Repulsion was conceived as a potboiler that could make financing available for Cul-de-sac. Rosemary's Baby represented a chance to conquer Hollywood by filming a best-selling novel. In a medium that involves vast sums of money, such strategies have ensured Polanski's position as a good financial risk. But commercial films have also expanded the resources of his art. His most mature, accomplished efforts, Macbeth, Chinatown, and Tess, show an assured sense of the interactions between art and culture that Polanski gained while coming to terms with the issues posed by the popular conventions represented by making his horror films. I love the cliches, Polanski has said. Practically every film I make starts with one. I just try to update them, give them acceptable shape. The way he updates cliches, typically by tearing them out of their expected context and turning them against his audience, implicitly forces us to confront the ways in which we use the institutions of popular genres to express and disguise the structures of power underlying social interaction. Among other things, Laura Mulvey has hypothesized, the position of the spectators in cinema is blatantly one of repression of their exhibitionism and projection of the repressed desire onto the performer. In horror stories, this process typically operates through the creation of a monstrous other, which, as Robin Wood has noted, represents what is repressed but never destroyed in the self, and projected outward in order to be hated and disowned. Many such stories feature villains who are identified as social outsiders. Polanski's tales of terror complicate this dynamic by making their protagonists outsiders, people trying to make their way in alien worlds. In Repulsion, Carol Ledoux is a Belgian, yet she lives in London. In Dance of the Vampires, Alfred is a German visiting Transylvania for the first time. In Rosemary's Baby, a young, newly married woman from the Midwest moves into a strange old New York City apartment building. In The Tenant, Trelkowski, a Pole, tries desperately to survive in the hostile surroundings of Paris. Such a focus on protagonists who are themselves others arouses complex reactions that mix sympathy with xenophobic contempt for people who do not conform to accepted social standards. But if Polanski's horror films deal with outsiders to the worlds they portray, they are even more centrally concerned with the outsiders who invariably exist within these worlds: women. The presence of women in such stories raises cultural anxieties not only about social status, but also about sexual identity. Terrifying tales of female victimage have their roots in the Gothic fiction that flourished in later 18th century Britain with works such as The Castle of Otranto, The Monk, and The Mysteries of Udolpho. Such tales continue today in the form of pulp novels by writers in the tradition of Daphne du Maurier and popular movies such as Halloween. Most often, these stories have centered on a shy, nervous, retiring heroine who is nevertheless usually possessed of a remarkable ability to survive hideously dangerous situations. No matter what happened, she never acted to direct events. Pursued by unspeakable horrors, she was the object of desire and reward. The hero was likely to be a powerfully masculine figure who, nevertheless, succumbed to the heroine's charms, thereby allowing the plot to be harmoniously concluded with a marriage. Such a narrative pattern displaces and ultimately denies female sexuality by surreptitiously encoding perceptions about the subjugation of women and the covert social purposes of marriage and marital fidelity. In Polanski's horror films, women often become subjects rather than objects. Consequently, their own sexuality is much more at issue. Both Carol Ledoux and Rosemary Woodhouse are plagued by demons inextricably connected with their femininity. Carol by her beauty and desirability to men, Rosemary by her pregnancy. And though Dance of the Vampires and The Tenant feature male rather than female protagonists, their uncertain sense of gender identity becomes a major source of sexual conflict for them. Unlike classic paradigms of the genre such as Dracula and Frankenstein, which usually take place in remote locales, Polanski's horror films, with the exception of Dance of the Vampires, which parodies the genre's traditional iconography, are set in modern urban environments. In contrast to the spare and bizarre locations of the modernist films, these settings include a wealth of plausible social and physical detail, which encourages us to see the protagonist's problems within a believable context. The protagonists of Polanski's horror films are oppressed both by a bigoted society and by a malevolent nature. Repulsion depicts a sexually grotesque culture in scenes set in the beauty parlor where the heroine works and in the pub where her boyfriend passes the time. The Tenant perceives society in terms of sadomasochistic interactions between bullying French landlords and victimized foreign tenants. Rosemary's Baby uses its realistic mise-en-scène to suggest the ways in which an ordinary setting may gradually begin to appear menacing and portentous, or even to an ostensibly normal heroine. Paradoxically, this increased emphasis on a realistic social and psychological environment allows Polanski to explore individual psychology more intensely and completely than he could in the abstracted settings of the modernist films. By focusing in these films on a single, fully developed individual within a recognizable setting, Polanski invokes many of the expectations of filmic realism. At the same time, however, the horror genre also poses an implicit challenge to realism, for it places the realist vision of plausible social interaction against a more primitive worldview that understands the universe in terms of magic and supernatural forces. Tzvetan Todorov's description of the fantastic as an effect growing out of the ambiguous tension between the uncanny, in which the protagonist is insane, and the marvelous, in which the supernatural reigns supreme, is well expressed in Polanski's films. Repulsion and The Tenant feature protagonists who are insane, while Rosemary's Baby offers a supernatural explanation for the bizarre situations it depicts. In each case, however, tension is built by playing on the ambiguous interactions between realism and fantasy. Apologies for the spoilers on those other two films. The confusion between inner and outer reality engendered by the fantastic reflect modes of experience that are psychologically infantile, recalling a narcissistic period of development in which the individual was unable to distinguish itself from the world around it. Polanski's horror films achieve their effect by reproducing such infantile states both in their protagonists and in the audiences. Due to his early interest in the surrealists, who experimented with the artistic depiction of unconscious thought processes, Polanski commands an impressive arsenal of resources with which he is able to express such confusion. Though all of Polanski's films are about insanity, in the horror films, insanity is expressed in storylines that are more linear and complex than those of modernist films. If the modernist films reproduce narcissistic enemy through stylized technique and caricatures of sexual obsession, the horror films, through their protagonists, trace the development of regressive modes of relating inner and outer reality that lead to such states. Some of the modernist films hint at such narrative development. The old woman in When Angels Fall harbors increasingly disturbed fantasies. The male protagonists of Knife in the Water and Cul-de-sac turn from attempts at developing sexual relationships with their wives to more violent encounters with other men and finally to schizoid passivity as the action progresses. The horror films, however, develop this motif more fully. Carol Ledoux's tentative courtship and repulsion gradually deteriorates into violence and catatonia. Alfred's romantic aspirations and Dance of the Vampires are eventually rewarded by having his beloved suck his body dry of blood. Rosemary Woodhouse's adoration of her handsome husband turns into a feeling of dread centered on the alien being that is growing inside her. Trelkovsky feels himself first an unwelcome tenant in his apartment building, his adopted country, and then eventually within his own body. The hero's frustrated attempts to achieve mature sexual fulfillment drive them back into a world of violence and rage that ultimately expresses itself in terms of fragmented body images and aberrant perceptions of the universe. In the modernist works, the hero's ultimate powerlessness is normally expressed through static and objectified images. We watch from outside as George crouches fetally on a rock at the end of Cul-de-sac and as André sits immobilized at the wheel of his car in Knife in the Water. In the horror films, however, Polanski exploits surrealist techniques to express his hero's conflicts subjectively, to encourage us to see the world in the distorted and fantastic vision of the protagonists. Though we may perceive the threatening quality of this world as the product of madness, it is nonetheless a madness we come to share intimately. Many shots show the protagonists in profile at the side of the frame, watching the action along with the spectators. Moreover, tracking shots accommodate to their movements more sympathetically than the coldly objective still camera setups Polanski favors in the modernist films. In Repulsion, our terror at the sight of the catatonic Carol lying under the bed at the movie's conclusion is experienced in the context of our sympathetic understanding of her sexual disgust earlier in the film. We can participate in her anguish. Though Rosemary Woodhouse's paranoid sense of a conspiracy is ultimately validated, we are still moved by the way the specter of witchcraft forces her to look and behave more and more like an infant until at last she meekly submits her adult will to the authoritarian control of a group of Satanists. By contrast, we ultimately judge Trelkovsky insane in The Tenant, yet his early efforts at ingratiating himself with his callous neighbors and co-workers evoke our empathy. As T.J. Ross has noted, the films place us in such relation to the inner circumstances of their wild protagonists as to open up for us perspectives on the everyday scene of an eerie acuity and intransigence. As a result, we feel intimately involved in the fates of these characters, in contrast to the modernist films, which begin with images of the absurd and grotesque. Anomalies emerge only gradually in the horror films. Initially, everything appears natural. We, and the protagonists, are drawn into a more regressive mode. Whether sane or insane, all of the protagonists of the horror films are marked by a sense of disassociation between self and body. This sense is closely related to their feelings of sexual dis-ease. Polanski has developed ingenious methods of expressing this dis-ease while staying within popular realist conventions. In such regressed states, everything becomes an extension of the traumatic schism between body and self. Hence, images of fragmented or mutilated bodies abound. Many of the scenes in Repulsion open with extreme close-ups of body parts taken from unfamiliar angles. Frozen bodies reappear through Dance of the Vampires. Rosemary Woodhouse's body is misshapen by pregnancy. Trelkovsky disguises his body by creating a new one, which is flamboyantly female. This discomforting sense of physical alienation is also projected outward onto the environment. Accordingly, what often appears superficially as unnatural mise-en-scène is revealed as a subjective expression of the protagonist's disturbed perception. The anthropomorphized apartments in which these characters live, with their dilating rooms and womb-like corridors, update salient features of the large looming castles in which horror stories have traditionally been enacted. In addition, images of rotting food and of repulsively wrinkled old people present the world as a terrifyingly real portrayal of psychotic perception. When the environment is not perceived as an extension of a devalued body image, it is likely to be seen by these insecure characters as a threat to that image. The heroes of the horror films are obsessed with fantasies of plots against them, and Polanski's cinematography encourages similar fears in the spectator. The mise-en-scène often seems to be harboring hidden, portentous points of view. In one scene from Dance of the Vampires, we watch a horrifying incident that features Alfred and Abronsius driving a stake into a vampire's heart. Their actions are, however, presented in silhouette as they move about behind a sheet. Though the camera soon reveals the joke, the two are actually rehearsing with the pillow, the message to the audience is clear. We may also be victimized by our partial vision of the action, which the director may plot in such a way as to punish us with shocking outbreaks of horror and violence. The ambiguous nature of Polanski's realistic mise-en-scène surfaces dramatically at the moments when the films achieve the effect of deep space by means of extremely wide fisheye lenses. Realistic depiction then gives way to a distorted vision that imposes menacingly on the spectator by reflecting the paranoid projections of disturbed sensibilities. In Repulsion, Carol looks at her face reflected in a kettle and later watches the living room of her apartment yawn cavernously before her, an effect achieved, in this case, by the use of specially built sets as well as special lenses. The apartments of Rosemary Woodhouse and Trelkovsky take on similar ominous dimensions as their inhabitants grow increasingly anxious, and the faces of others, too, degenerate into misshapen leers. Even Alfred in Dance of the Vampires is terrorized by the distorted features of Herbert, the lecherous homosexual vampire who has designs on him. Let's see. Such distorted images may also express the protagonist's distorted sexual desires. These characters often look out through peepholes or peek out of windows, attempting to see others without being seen by them. The director includes the audience in his descent into voyeuristic passivity by presenting his characters themselves as objects of exhibitionistic display. These films all end with portraits within the cinematic text of audiences who coldly and sadistically view the protagonists as grotesque spectacles. In Repulsion, several neighbors gather to gape at Carol's rigidly catatonic form. In Dance of the Vampires, the guests all at the ball catch out the three main characters by isolating the images of their bodies in a mirror. In Rosemary's Baby, the members of the coven gathered in the Castevet's apartment quietly observe Rosemary as she wields a carving knife in a last, wildly extravagant attempt to save her baby. And the tenant concludes by transforming the courtyard of Trelkovsky's building into a theater where the neighbors gather to applaud and jeer at the hero's suicide attempt. These audiences mirror the response of the film's audience itself, which is increasingly encouraged to react to the protagonists in just this way, as alien and objectified others, projections of forbidden impulses within ourselves. Polanski's horror films do not simply illustrate cultural processes that victimize and warp the powerless. They ask us to recapitulate our own participation in such processes, and they expose social and psychological structures of domination that popular conventions naturalize. In these films, the subject is not others, but otherness itself. This apparently is the kind of thing the director has in mind when he speaks of updating the cliches. Rosemary's Baby has been the most popular of all of Polanski's horror films. To him, it represented a chance to prove himself in Hollywood, the place that belonged more to my dreams than to my reality, at the threshold of where everything would be handed to me. His name was put forward for the project by Robert Evans, then an executive at Paramount, who had been impressed by Repulsion. Hollywood producer William Castle, who owned the rights to Ira Levin's best-selling novel and had originally wanted to use it for his own directing debut, agreed to let Polanski do the project after the young Polish filmmaker enthusiastically pledged to adapt the book with a minimum number of changes. Polanski wrote the screenplay himself with some assistance from the film's designer, Richard Silbert. The project was a great success, both critically and commercially, making over $30 million and spawning a whole genre of enormously popular devil child pictures such as The Exorcist and The Omen. As a consequence, Polanski became a highly bankable commodity in the world's film capital, and though the director was later to comment that the film was less personal because it didn't start as my project, he found ways of incorporating his own concerns into the finished work. Levin's 1967 book describes a young, newly married woman who is impregnated by the devil shortly after moving into the Bramford, a strange old apartment building inhabited by witches. The story encouraged Polanski to focus on the psychology of a complex individual who exists within a coherent social and physical environment. The fears aroused by his adaptation ultimately take the form of infantile terrors centering on bodily integrity. The film turns the conventional cinematic cliches of innocent, childish experience back on themselves to reveal a world in which the psychological and the factual are terrifyingly indistinguishable, evoking the fantastic effect Todorov describes. The novel, by contrast, displaces this psychological issue onto the physical universe. In this book, Rosemary's problem is not that she has the prepartum crazies, as her actor husband Guy suggests, but that there is an actual plot against her instigated by the devil himself. By being encouraged to attribute the mysterious phenomena she encounters to the workings of supernatural powers, we are reassured about the disturbing connotations of Rosemary's emotional state. Excuse me. Though Polanski's screenplay stays close to Levin's original story, the movie maximizes the ambiguity between paranoid projection and real events that the novel repeatedly strives to resolve. Among Polanski's films, Rosemary's Baby is most similar to Repulsion, from which it borrows much of its iconography, most especially its anthropomorphized depiction of the Woodhouse's apartment. Here, however, in place of the insane heroine of Repulsion, a diabolical universe is ultimately exposed, but in both cases, the audience's growing uncertainty about the nature of the reality that is being presented creates suspense and involvement. Though Polanski initially takes pains to establish a strong sense of verisimilitude as his stories proceed, this initially credible facade increasingly polarizes into two divergent strands: perverse projection or diabolical plot. In Rosemary's Baby, the audience leaves the theater with a strong sense that the narrative has validated the heroine's vision of a plot, which has led many critics to comment that the film actually diminishes the ambiguity of the novel. And at a certain level, this is true. The world Polanski has created is filled with paranoid images. He often shoots his characters flanked by the strong verticals of the apartment's doorways which visually constrict them. Near the end, we feel Rosemary's entrapment even more powerfully because of the film's imagery of imprisonment. When the evidence seems overwhelmingly to point to the Castevet's guilt, Rosemary appears in a gray and white striped dress and is put to nap by Dr. Hill on a similarly striped couch, while the bar-like shadows of the Venetian blinds fall across her face. Though such images present the heroine as clearly and unambiguously trapped, we may overlook the question of what is trapping her. The film offers a good deal of evidence that the trap exists within Rosemary herself. Polanski makes her psychological vulnerability more plausible by isolating her from family and from any benign neighbors, both of whom provide her with a certain security in the novel. But the triggering mechanism of her breakdown is her pregnancy. Later, when her baby is born, the source of her anxiety shifts from terror that part of her objectified body could be appropriated by others, to an ambivalent hatred, affection toward the part of her body that is no longer hers, a response Alan Moore has called the motif of revulsion against newborn life. Accordingly, she sees her baby first as endangered, then as diabolical. To Rosemary, pregnancy represents the public avowal of her sexuality. The viewer is alerted to the issue of sexual repression early in the film when Guy playfully caresses his wife's back in the elevator on their way up to view the apartment. Polanski follows the gesture with a close-up of the elevator attendant looking at them ominously. Shortly afterward, when her husband kisses her in the kitchen of their prospective home, Mr. Nicholas, the building superintendent, comments from the next room, "No, no, 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 not in the apartment." Though he is referring to an earlier question about where the previous tenant had died, the timing of his exclamation suggests the embarrassment connected with open displays of sexual passion. Later, the heroine dreams of her Catholic girlhood inside of the figure of a disapproving nun. Later, the heroine's dreams of her Catholic girlhood include the figure of a disapproving nun. When she is first told of her pregnancy, she herself wears a nun-like white-collared black dress, as she had done when she defended the Pope on her first visit to her sinister neighbors, the Castevets. Yet, though Rosemary is anxious about sexuality, she also has erotic desires. To resolve her dilemma, she conjures up an image of power and violence that is both erotic and punitive, a diabolical rapist. As Ernest Jones has formulated such a situation, sometimes voluptuous feelings are coupled with those of angst, especially with women, who often believe that the night fiend has copulated with them. While being raped by what she imagines as the devil, Rosemary is aware that her reaction is observed by the nude coven, which is pictured through a wide-angle distortion suggesting grotesque fantasy. Following her dream of sadistic and guilty eroticism, we see Rosemary in bed while her husband is sleeping, as if to emphasize her emotional and physical isolation from him. After confirming that she is indeed pregnant, Rosemary finds her body strange and repulsive. She begins to feed it disgusting foods, raw meat and an unpalatable-looking drink made for her by Minnie Castevet. Soon she tries to deny her sexuality by assuming the pose of a pre-sexual child. To avoid facing the fact that she is having a baby, she becomes a baby. The winsome, ingenious presence of Mia Farrow is used to good effect to help make this transition credible. As her body grows more distended, she has her hair cut to a babyish length by Vidal Sassoon. As the heroine's figure changes, idealized representations of bodies begin to intrude in the mise-en-scène, suggesting Rosemary's increasing estrangement from her own body. A slim, long-legged nude statue occupies an important position in the frame when Rosemary is feeling unwell on the first day of her period, and we see the statue again as she sits in front of the television set doubled over in pain, watching women dancers moving in perfect synchronization. Polanski associates a second, limbless statue with Guy, who rehearses for a new role on crutches, a visual symbol of impotence. "I'm in love with no one, especially not your fat wife," he says. "I'm a hopeless cripple. Rosemary, who arrives home from Vidal Sassoon in time to hear this speech, later adopts more childish clothing and loses weight. Her more immediate response, however, is to announce that she is in pain. At this moment, the camera moves to focus in on the gracefully thin, long-limbed nude statue. The limbless statue appears behind Guy again when his newly pregnant wife confronts him about not looking at me, and it is also shown when he hesitates to touch Rosemary's stomach after she jubilantly announces, "It's alive." The fears of sexuality and pregnancy that Guy may also harbor are in keeping with generalized social attitudes. Once Rosemary becomes pregnant, everyone begins to treat her strangely. The exaggerated fussing of the Castevets and of her friends at the party she gives is complemented by her husband's attitude of fear and avoidance. All convince her that her body has become an object of special consideration, for she is treated more as a pregnancy than as a person. Such a response contains components of sexual inhibition similar to those embedded in the solicitous cluckings of Minnie and Laura Louise when Rosemary earlier announces that she is menstruating. These attitudes form the background of her paranoia, and the audience responds to them as unremarkable because we are part of the same culture. Yet social attitudes per se are not at issue here so much as the more global worldview implied by religious conviction. Polanski's Rosemary's Baby speaks to the ludicrous nature of all religious beliefs, for all religions grant the world an unambiguous meaning that the film wants to deny. The book, by contrast, unambiguously accepts the reality of devils and of God. The most striking difference between the film and the novel is the way in which the supernatural motif is handled. While Levin's story ultimately takes the question of the existence of God and the devil seriously, Polanski relentlessly satirizes religion throughout the film by equating good with evil. Rosemary's uneasy agnosticism, an important theme in the book, is glossed over in the film, which includes a shot of a Time magazine cover announcing God is dead. As several critics have noted, the movie's final scene with Rosemary in Madonna-like attire receiving a foreigner bringing gifts explicitly parodies the birth of Christ. Earlier during the dinner, Rosemary and Guy share with their friend Hutch. Polanski adds a ghoulish joke about the Agnus Dei of Christian mythology. They cooked and ate several young children, including a niece, observes Hutch, describing the activities of the infamous Trench sisters who formerly occupied the Bramford. Meanwhile, he serves the lamb he has just taken from the oven while his guests sip wine. The witch's cannibalism is thereby casually equated with Christian ritual. The conversation continues with Hutch's comment. In 1959, a dead infant was found wrapped in a newspaper in the basement, to which Guy responds, you really rouse my appetite. Drink your wine, Hutch replies. Such equations of orthodox religion with profane sects suggest that all religious beliefs are characterized by the projection of dark impulses that exist within their devotees. If such dark impulses may motivate Rosemary's growing faith in a cult, they may also motivate the audience's desire to reach a similar point of certainty within the slippery world of the film. For Polanski calls all belief into question by continually playing tricks with the film's illusion of reality. On the one hand, he repeatedly flaunts its verisimilitude. It is clear, for instance, that Mia Farrow actually has blood drawn from her arm at the scene in which Rosemary first visits the obstetrician, Dr. Hill. At the same time, however, the meaning of the most naturalistic images is continually called into question. Half-open doorways suggest a hidden reality by the partial views they offer of what is happening behind them, for people and actions are often only half seen. Rosemary's actor-husband Guy clearly shows her both of his shoulders, as in the novel, to prove he has not been marked by the witches. But Rosemary looks dissatisfied at this revelation and does not respond, all right, as she does in the book. By thus problematizing what the film shows us, Polanski leaves the audience with no conclusive sense of the nature of the reality he is depicting. Similar ambiguities are invoked by the casting of minor parts. The seemingly trustworthy Dr. Hill is played by Charles Grodin, whose too even voice and manner would type him in later roles as a duplicitous opportunist. Elisha Cook, familiar to moviegoers as a small-time hood, has here been transformed into Mr. Nicholas, a prim building superintendent. Conversely, Ralph Bellamy, long known for portrayals of bland but honest businessmen, has become a sinister, bearded Jewish physician. Though all of these performers play their roles creditably, the audience remains vaguely uneasy about them. Sound gradually becomes ambiguous as well. An unexplained crashing sound interrupts Rosemary's conversation with her neighbor in the building's laundry room. As in the book, the heroine ascribes its sinister overtones to the event. Earlier, during Rosemary and Guy's first evening together in their new living quarters, the expected sound of the traffic and of a plane overhead are interrupted by another more inexplicable sound of chanting. Guy's joking remark, "Shh, I think I hear the Trench sisters chewing," relegates the strange noises in the old building to supernatural causes, lightly invoking a level of explanation that Rosemary will take more seriously as she becomes more and more obsessed with the peculiar sounds she hears from the Castevet's apartment. The meaning of words can also be treacherous. Mr. Nicholas's protest, no, not in the apartment, is a case in point. And later, when Rosemary's friend Hutch remarks that World War II brought tenants back to the notorious Bramford, Rosemary's subsequent exclamation, "Terrific," prompts him to inquire, "What, the house?" To which she responds, "No, the lamb." Such misunderstandings suggest the difficulty of interpreting language. Similar ambiguities arise as Rosemary later tries to use a Scrabble set to decipher the anagram that holds the key to the diabolical plot against her. Polanski's camera lingers over such ambiguities to emphasize their inherently irresolvable nature. Hence, until Rosemary finally draws an irrevocable conclusion about her surroundings, the pacing is slow. At moments of great stress, such as when the coven enters the apartment, and when she wakes after having given birth, we even hear clocks ticking. What may finally be accepted as plausible may in fact be only what serves the interest of the psyche. Accordingly, changes in the environment echo the stages of Rosemary's regression. As her sense of security ebbs away, the filmic effects increasingly emphasize a threatened and polarized vision of the world. The paternal intimacy of Hutch's apartment gives way to a childishly rendered Alice in Wonderland vastness when Rosemary and Guy are in their own apartment due to the wide-angle perspectives viewed from camera positions near the floor. The distorting and intimidating effect of wide-angle photography is even more pronounced near the end of the film when a handheld camera precedes the fleeing Rosemary down the cavernous passages to the safety of her apartment. Similarly, the sweet harmonies of the film's opening lullaby are eventually replaced by dissonances that dramatize both Rosemary's pain and the diabolical machinations that she perceives around her. And the film's color at first contrasts to the foreboding darkness of the apartments belonging to Hutch and to the elderly Miss Gardenia with the bright primary hues of the youthful Rosemary and Guy. Soon, however, this transformation leads to the garish discordances of the Castavets and ultimately to the devastating conflagrations depicted in their painting of a burning church. The film's conclusion, in which the coven is revealed as an actuality, allows the audience to escape confronting these disturbing intimations of infantile psychological states. In a deeper way, however, Polanski decisively implicates us in such states through his naturalized portrayal of a fantastic world, for it is finally that dimension of the film that frightens us. By involving us with a seemingly normal character in a seemingly normal world, Rosemary's Baby gradually takes not only its heroine but also its audience back to a time of powerlessness and of traumatic confusion between fantasy and reality. Though we never see Rosemary's Baby, the last image of Rosemary herself superimposes its unnatural eyes over her own, for the alien forces that terrorize her ultimately rise from within herself. The spectator's involvement with her is an involvement with these internal forces, but to leave Polanski's film confident of its outcome is thus to deny the nature of our participation in it. For the horror generated by Rosemary's Baby is finally a horror of the helpless infancy we all once suffered. That is the end of that. Well, I have to say, there was a lot of words there. I think the person who wrote that was very perceptive. But I think once we get into inspecting angles and framing and stuff like that, it loses me. It's too much. It's too, I don't know what word to use on that one. I'm not that much of an expert, actually. But it is interesting, I suppose, to read about it, although I didn't get a lot of those things. Anyway, so the next chapter, I don't know when I'm going to read it, it'll probably be a couple of days, is there's two movies that they cover here, The Exorcist and Don't Look Now. And I actually have never seen, at least I don't think I've ever seen Don't Look Now, so I have at least one movie that I have to watch before I read this, but this is a double. It's actually two different people. One writes about, I don't understand why they didn't split it up into two essays, but I guess they're connected enough to be included together. So, that's, I don't know, sometime a couple of days from now I'll read that one. I'll get back to Sagan when I read again. See ya.